Hello again, and welcome to Counterpoint. My guest in this episode of Counterpoint is very, very interesting. It's hard to know where to start with this guest. This is Alan Shatter, who spent 30 years in the Oireachtas. He may not be done yet, and quite a bit of time as well as the Minister responsible for Defence and Justice and the Gardaí. So quite a portfolio, a prolific writer of fact and fiction, and a prolific producer of private members' bills throughout his career. Extraordinary mind. I've met Alan just once or twice before, especially during Jack and Jill Children's Foundation opposition to the putting of the Children's Hospital in the current site, in the site that it eventually went into. So I'm going to talk to Alan about that. But first, I want to ask you a tough question, Alan. Right, and it's the question of the day. Right, and then we'll get into all the other stuff, all the other fascinating stuff. Are you finished? Are you going to start? Are you going to stand again?
I don't think I'm finished. I did think I wouldn't return to public life or attempt to return to public life, but I've been watching events from a distance. I find a lot of what I see both frustrating and annoying, and I think the general public deserve better. I've been put under a lot of pressure by some very good and nice people in the constituency I live in. Over the past year, I've had so many people asking me, would I run for the Dáil again? Would I go back to the Dáil? In the beginning, I really didn't think this was an issue. And then we created the inheritance tax reform campaign back in June last. And basically we're advocating for the abolition of inheritance tax, and we can get into that later on if you wish. A lot of people at a huge public meeting we held again urged me to run for the Dáil, and then the government just completely failed to adequately address the unfairness of the inheritance tax legislation and its discriminatory impacts on so many people. So to get to the real answer to the question, I have, you see, this strange aspiration to get into the Guinness Book of Records as the oldest comeback kid in politics.
Oh.
So, there's a very real likelihood that I'm going to run in the next election.
Well, thank you for being so frank and honest. I mean, we're date stamping this to the 17th of October here, and it does feel as if there's a general election around the corner. We had a little chat off camera, and you reckon it's sitting out there probably. We'll be turning up to vote at some stage on week 4 in November, or week 1 in December, on the basis of your kind of feeling about it. I'm delighted to hear that you're coming back, Alan. I think it would be very welcome for people outside of your constituency just looking in, because we know you so well. But I want to get into other stuff first, if I may, before we kind of focus on local stuff. I had to reacquaint myself again this morning with just the history of the Jewish race, all the ways back to 3,500 BCE, and all the way through all the various invasions, the Babylonians, and then Cyrus the Persian, the liberation out of Babylon, and the first temple being destroyed, and then the second temple being rebuilt, all the way through. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary history. You had to deal with the Greeks. They had to deal with the Greeks. They had to deal with the Romans. They had to deal with the Ottomans. They had to deal with the Mamluks, and then finally the British. And then we had the development of Zionism. This request, this urge for a Jewish state from Herzl at the end of the 19th century. I'm saying that simply because a lot of people don't know this stuff.
Sure.
They haven't reacquainted themselves with it, and are just looking at current headlines, just to kind of frame that. And then when we come to since the foundation of the Israel state, we've had the Arab-Israeli war, the Suez Crisis, 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Lebanon War, the First Intifada, the Second Intifada, and now the Israeli-Hamas conflict. I mean, it's just been an absolute nightmare for everybody in the region since not just this century, but going back for thousands of years.
Well, the biggest nightmare, Eddie, for the Jewish people is what you left out. The Jewish people went through many, many hundreds of years of difficulties and persecution. In between those times, there were good times in different parts of the globe in which they lived. But when there were good times always later were followed by persecution. So you go back to the time of the Spanish Inquisition when all the Jews were expelled from Spain, and then Portugal replicated that. So go back to England in the 1200s when again all the Jews living in Britain were expelled. So this is part of Jewish history, but of course the greatest tragedy in Jewish history and what everything ultimately led to over 3,000 years was the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were exterminated by Nazi Germany, and various other European countries were complicit in that, and we could spend a long time talking about that. Herzl, who was the founder of Zionism, had a very right and long-term vision at the end of the 1800s.
He was German or Austrian or something?
He was Austrian,
Austrian,
and he was an Austrian Jew, and he concluded that the only thing that would ultimately save the Jewish people was that the Jewish people should exercise the right to self-determination in their ancient homeland and have the same right to self-determination as other peoples have.
Including the Irish, by the way, because while he was doing that, I mean, there was a wave of kind of self-determination happening in many places, including here in Ireland.
This was something in the early part of the 1900s. And there was, in fact, a degree of affinity between what was happening in Ireland and what ultimately took place in the Middle East. What people in Ireland don't seem to understand is that the portion of lands that we now reference as Israel and the West Bank and Gaza were for 500 years occupied by the Ottoman Empire. There was no Palestinian state, there was no Israeli state, they were occupied lands. And at the end of the First World War, though that area of land, together with today's Jordan, became part of a mandated territory that the British ruled. But the British had made a decision, the Balfour Declaration, that ultimately the Jewish people would be allowed return to their homeland. And there were a lot of difficulties from 1920 through to 1948. There was at that stage, Israel did not exist. There was an Arab community within that area. There was a Jewish community within that area. There was actually a Jewish majority in Jerusalem going back to the mid-1800s and from then on, which people don't seem to understand. And that was a very difficult period. Pre the Second World War, you had various events where Jewish people were slaughtered in that area. There was Hebron is a part of ancient biblical Israel that Jewish people had lived in small numbers for centuries. And you had in 1929 a pogrom where the Arab community slaughtered the Jews of Hebron. That had nothing to do with an Israeli state. And then, of course, we had the Second World War, and you had
the Holocaust.
You had the Holocaust. From an Irish perspective, which people tend not to realize or understand, is in the 1930s, many Jewish people wrote to Ireland, to the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Justice here, seeking permission to come to Ireland to escape the Nazis. No more than a handful were allowed to come to Ireland. Within the records of the Department of Justice, which I examined many years ago when I was doing research as a student, there were heart-rending pleas from desperate families to be allowed to come to Ireland, and the recommendation from Bewley, who was the then anti-Semitic Irish ambassador in Berlin, was don't let Jews into Ireland because they'll contaminate the country. And that was the policy that Ireland adopted.
Well, can I share a quick story with you? Some years ago, I was asked to visit Gerald Goldberg in Cork, who was the former Lord Mayor Fianna Fáil.
I knew Gerald, yeah.
Oh, did you indeed? Right. I only met him one afternoon, and I went to see him in Bentruda, his house on the Watchtown Road. And he was showing me his book collection was absolutely astounding.
Yeah.
But in the course of that discussion, he said something casually to me that always stuck with me. He said that that De Valera's plan during the Second World War, in the event of a German invasion of Ireland, I think it was called Operation Emerald, in case they came in, was to round up the Jews and to put them into a camp in Cavan and basically separate them from the Irish population. That was the solution. And I mentioned this some years ago casually in a radio interview, and I had historians descending on me, giving out yards that there was no evidence of this.
Sure.
But I'm saying it here on the record. I mean, this is what he told me.
I have no idea. Is that accurate? Is it not accurate? But what is
would
accurate?
It surprise you?
What is accurate is that not only were Jews not allowed into Ireland to escape Nazi tyranny after it was known they were being persecuted and put into camps in Germany. After the concentration camps were discovered and people were liberated from the concentration camps, Ireland resolutely refused to admit the survivors from the strict concentration camps to Ireland. And that was the difficulty of Jewish people across Europe. And of course, a lot of the Jewish people across Europe then went to the Palestinian mandated territory. It was only called Palestine, by the way, from the time the British took over. It was called the Palestinian Mandate.
The British took over when the Ottomans
they took over in 1920 after the First World War, and Palestine was synonymous with the Jewish people going there at the time. And then you got to 1948, and the great tragedy of 1948 is that there was never any need for conflict after it. In 1947, you had the United Nations Declaration that there'd be basically a two-state solution, that there'd be a Jewish state called Israel, that there'd be an Arab state, it wasn't referenced as a Palestinian state, there'd be a separate Arab state, and that Jerusalem would be an international city with access for everybody. That was the decision of the United Nations in 1947. 1948, Israel declared its independence, and the immediate aftermath of that was Israel was invaded by all the surrounding Arab countries who were dedicated to its total destruction, and it had to fight for its life. And what isn't understood in Ireland is
what is forgotten
is the ultimate outcome of that war was that West Jerusalem became part of the Israeli state. East Jerusalem was occupied by Jordan. The West Bank was occupied by Jordan. Gaza was occupied by Egypt. And that is where the world remained all the way through other difficulties that occurred until we got to 1967. But at the very start of all of this, the United Nations and the international community envisaged a two-state solution with two peoples living next to each other in peace and harmony. And tragically, the objective of destroying the Israeli state created where we are today. And that objective is consistent because where we are today and what isn't understood about today's conflict is the objective now of the Iranians is the destruction of the Israeli state. Their terrorist proxies are Hamas in Gaza, who wish to destroy the Israeli state, Hezbollah, who have basically taken over Lebanon as Iranian proxies, want to destroy the Israeli state. And of course, the irony is that there's peace between Egypt and Jordan, who were the original states that attacked it. And Syria is in such a continuing state of disarray that at the present time, it doesn't want to apparently destroy Israel, but it's a safe haven for Hezbollah and Iranian revolutionaries who are equally intent on the destruction of the Israeli state.
But isn't it fair to say, though, just to come back there on it's the Iranian regime is the issue rather than the Iranian people?
The Iranian regime is a tyranny. It's been there since 1979. The Iranian people, I want to be rid of it. It persecutes its own people to an extraordinary degree. Women are particular targets. Women have been murdered in prisons. They've been blinded in prisons because they've refused to cover their heads. They've been arrested in the streets and beaten up. And the gay community, basically in Iran, if you're identified as gay, you're likely to be hung. And the Iranians in the last since the start of this year, have executed over 250 people in Iran. And for some very odd and peculiar reason, the Irish government, over the past 12 to 18 months, has in an extraordinary way, a bizarre way, embraced Iranian tyranny. Knowing Iran is behind the terrorism of Hezbollah and Hamas, knowing that Iran provides them with training, provides them with funding, provides them with missiles. The Irish government decided this September to open an embassy in Iran. It never publicly criticizes Iran for encouraging terrorism, not just through Hezbollah and Hamas directed at Israel, but being the main propagators of terrorism throughout the Middle East, to include the Houthis and elsewhere. You had the very strange event last spring that no media in Ireland commented on. They seemed to think this was normal. You had the Israeli ambassador in Ireland excluded from attending the Ardèches of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and also the Green Ardèche. And traditionally, all the ambassadors are invited to these events. But who was welcome and acclaimed present at the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and I understand also the Green Conference, they don't call it an Ardèche, the Iranian ambassador. The Iranian ambassador who has never been called in, never been in receipt of a complaint for the horrendous mayhem, death and destruction that Iran is directly responsible for.
When you then look, just to get to the centre of this for just general concern, looking in from the outside, do you think that the response from the Netanyahu administration, separating, the Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas, understanding the separation like the Iranian people and the Iranian regime, and the same with Lebanon and Hezbollah, do you think that the response has been proportionate or disproportionate?
Let me explain, Eddie, where I come from. I've been a regular visitor over the years to the Middle East.
And you write in the Jerusalem Post.
And I've written about Middle Eastern issues for a long time.
In local newspapers.
The oddity is, in Ireland, apparently, as I'm Jewish, none of the media regard me as having any expertise in the area, which is quite bizarre because I've hardly been engaged in a single interview about events since the dreadful atrocity of the 7th of October of last year, which is quite extraordinary. But I'm a regular visitor. I've met most of the leading Israeli politicians over the last 35 years. I've met all of the leading Palestinians. I would have met Yasser Arafat lots of times, Mahmoud Abbas, various Palestinian negotiators. I've been in Gaza. I've been involved in some issues behind the scenes myself that I haven't previously talked about. I absolutely believe that the only way this conflict will ever end is by a reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, by a two-state solution where you have two separate independent states living in stability and security side by side. That is the only solution. And I've had these discussions. Now we're coming to where we are today. You have to remember how the current series of dreadful and appalling events started. 7th of October 2023, as organised by Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, about 3,000 members of Hamas suddenly invaded Israel. 1,200 people slaughtered. 364 young people at a Nova music festival, where these were peaceniks. These were people who believed in Palestinians and Israelis getting together. They were at a music festival. They were doing what young people do in a music festival. They were hanging out and just getting on with life. 364 of them slaughtered. Some of the women raped. Some of the bodies had body parts removed from them. And this was at a music festival. And some of those at the music festival then were taken as hostages into Gaza. I'm very familiar with the kibbutzim adjacent to Gaza. Kibbutz Be'eri, which is a couple of kilometers away from Gaza, had over 100 people slaughtered that day. There was a number also taken to Gaza as hostages. An Irish girl, Emily Hand, who you may recall, 7.5 years old. Her father, Tom Hand, born in Ireland, had lived on the kibbutz for many years. Who takes a 7.5-year-old child as a hostage? Now, fortunately, Emily was released after about 50 days. There are still to this day hostages from that kibbutz held in Gaza.
But go back to the issue, though.
No, I'm trying to explain the Israeli psyche and where this is. The only objective of Hamas isn't a two-state solution. It isn't two states living side by side. It's Israel's
eradication
and eradication. That's also the objective of Hezbollah.
And the Iranian regime.
and the Iranian regime. So as you and I are sitting here, there are 101 hostages still held in Gaza. It's believed that in the region of 45 of those have been murdered. And it's their remains that are in Gaza and will not be released. And the Israeli government is in a completely impossible situation. Like you, like I think any human being, you look at events in Gaza, there's been dreadful casualties, children have lost their lives, innocent men and women have lost their lives. But what is never discussed in Ireland, what the Irish government chooses to ignore in the very selective narrative that they've decided for political expediency to adopt, what the Taoiseach ignores in his very theatrical, emotive, soundbite presentations designed for social media, is that there's only one reason why this war continues. If Hamas release the hostages, and if, like the IRA, Hamas put down their arms, the war is over. It's finished. But the Israelis are in an impossible situation. Hamas, when it can do so, still continues to fire rockets into Israel. They locate their munitions. They locate where they headquarter their terrorists under mosques, under residential apartments, under homes, under hospitals. Some of the hostages who were released back in December recorded that they were actually held in hospitals. They fire their missiles from those locations. And the dreadful situation the Israelis are in is either they fight a war that they see as crucial to prevent further atrocities such as October 7, or they allow Hamas simply to restore themselves in Gaza and continue to fire rockets. So the dreadful consequence of this is that there have been civilian deaths. Gaza is in a terrible state, and the reality that is ignored in this country is Hamas is a death cult. The Hamas leadership doesn't care about the fate of ordinary Palestinians. About 500 kilometers worth of tunnels have been constructed in Gaza over the past 15 years, wasting aid that went into Gaza for the benefit of the people. These must have cost hundreds of millions to have built. Not a single bomb shelter was created by Hamas for the ordinary population, knowing that they were going to go to war. What human being does this? They just don't care about the death
So
of
it's an
their own
existential.
population.
It's an existential war from an Israeli perspective, is what you're saying.
The Israelis are in an impossible situation. There's been
But do you think that justifies the level of
there's been an
violence?
estimated 16,000 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel.
But Alan, does it justify?
Well, the question is, what should the Israelis do? They're doing things that no army anywhere else in the world in any war has ever done. This is a war, just as the British and the Americans fought the Second World War, and there were terrible, dreadful, huge numbers of civilian casualties. I have never, ever met a member of the Israeli army or anyone in politics in Israel, except some of the most extreme lunatics who we might come back to talk, who ever wants to see any civilian casualties. They go to extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties. They're criticised for encouraging some of the population in Gaza to move from one area to a different area. Now, why have they been doing that? They've been doing that to save lives. And of course, on occasions, as happens in the fog of war, things have gone wrong. But if, again, as we're sitting here, Eddie, today, there was one instance of one child tragically contracting polio in Gaza. What was the result of that? The Israelis, in the middle of a war, where 101 hostages, including some children, are still held in Gaza, as Hamas continues to fire rockets at them, the Israelis agreed a polio vaccination program. A few weeks ago, 570,000 children in Gaza were vaccinated safely for polio. As you and I are doing this interview, the second polio inoculation is taking place. Those 570,000 children are being inoculated. And you have idiots on the streets of Ireland alleging that Israel is engaged in a genocide. What country engaged in a genocide facilitates in the middle of a war, as rockets are being fired at them and as their own citizens are held hostage, the vaccination of 570,000 children.
Good point. And is when you then look at the just the structure for a second, just the numbers, right? So the total population of Palestinians is around 14 million. There's 2 million of them within the Israeli state, and recent polls show 60% of them are quite happy with that arrangement. But at the same time, Jewish, Israelis themselves, some Israelis, some historians are of the view that the state of Israel, they claim, is an apartheid state, notwithstanding the fact that it's a representative democracy and it has all of the checks and balances of representative democracy.
That's a political charge.
Okay.
That has no credibility at all. I visit Israel regularly. As you say, the total Israeli population now is just under 10 million.
10 million.
About 2.2 million of that population are Israeli.
So about 70% is Jewish.
Are Israeli Muslims, and then there are smaller numbers of Christians and other religions. I'm the voluntary chairperson in Ireland of an organisation called Magen David Adom Ireland.
Okay.
Magen David Adom in Israel is the independent emergency medical response service. It's the ambulance service. It's the service that takes people to hospital. It's the service where if there's a road accident or someone has cardiac arrest or there's a terrorist atrocity, it's the service that goes to provide emergency medical help and assistance. It's also the blood service. It's an independent charity. It's not a government body. We have 3,000 employed professionals in Magen David Adom in Israel, and we have 30,000 volunteers who are fully trained as paramedics, but they're not paid, they're volunteers, and they engage. Every single community in Israel is represented within that organization, from the Druze community to the Muslim community to the Christian community to the Jewish community and to the subdivisions that you have also within the Christian community. It's a totally integrated, supportive organization. No such organization would exist in an apartheid state. If you look at Israeli hospitals, doctors in Israeli hospitals, students in Israeli universities, it is a totally integrated society.
Can I just ask you then about this? There was a law passed in, just looking at my notes, in 2018 by Knesset called Basic Law. And it seems to say that the nation state of Israel, that in other words, they're saying that the state of Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people. Hebrew is the official language. And it kind of gives undefined special status to Arabic language. And yet, what I find it very, very interesting, and it's not criticism, it's just interest, is that the actual the polls again show that those that are Palestinians within the state of Israel seem to be quite comfortable with the whole arrangement. And I mean that's what I find interesting, because it's not coming out in the mainstream media.
No, let me say something about the basic law. Israel doesn't have a written constitution like we have, and it needs a written constitution. And it's one of the things that when I've been in Israel, I think the last seminar I was engaged in Israel would have been in March of 2023, when I was involved in assisting people opposing judicial reforms that the right-wing Israeli government wanted to introduce, which were very ill-advised. But it doesn't have a written constitution, but it has a series of basic laws which are used by the Israeli courts to test other laws. And I personally disagree with this particular basic law. Israel is, in the context of how it's perceived, the nation state of the Jewish people. It's the only state of the Jewish people. There are a lot of other states across the world.
It's the only country in the world with a Jewish majority.
I mean, if you look around the Middle East, practically every state is officially a Muslim state. So it shouldn't be exceptional you have a Jewish state. But Israel has a very important Muslim Arab minority. They're part and parcel of the state. They have parties within the parliamentary system. The previous Israeli government was in liaison and coalition with one of the Arab parties, which wouldn't happen in an apartheid state. My objection to that basic law, and it's an objection shared by very many within the Israeli political mainstream is that law was a product of an Israeli right-wing government. I would have to say less right-wing than the current government, with which I would also have certain arguments. I think it was ill-advised. I think I think that it created a perception on the part of the Druze community and Israeli Muslim Arab community that they weren't as equal as everyone else was. But that's not the way the Israeli courts so far have dealt with it. The Israeli Supreme Court has taken on itself remit to protect constitutional and individual rights to an extent that they actually drive the current Israeli government around the bend, and rightly so, because they've managed to curtail their worst excesses. I've no doubt that's going to be revisited. But I'd put that in an Irish context, because you and I go back many years to when we had a constitution in Ireland that recited the special position of the Catholic Church.
Oh, yeah, well, we clerical fascism.
And the special position of the Catholic Church was something that profoundly impacted Irish politics for decades. And you have to remember, Israel is a younger state than Ireland, and it recognised other religions that existed. It referenced, for example, the Jewish congregation and the Protestant community. But the supreme religion in Ireland for decades in our constitution was the Catholic religion. Look, Israel has gone through a series of difficulties and birth pangs, and there's huge political debate and differences within Israeli society. I would personally like to see that basic law changed. But this has nothing to do with the concept of apartheid. And if I could give you one very profound example, without, I suppose, getting too distressed over it.
Yeah, take your time.
One of the more distressing events, and one among many, and there have been many in Gaza as well, but one of the more distressing events, as the voluntary Irish chairperson of Magen David Adom, I'm kept in touch with events. And so, as is a terrorist atrocity in Israel, if somebody is stabbed or somebody is run over by a terrorist in a car, or if missiles land on someone's house and Magen David Adom ambulances are called out, I would be getting communications about this. In August of this year, Hezbollah rocket hit the Golan Heights and landed on the playing pitch of a Druze village. So you had Hezbollah, fanatical Shia Islamists, killing members of the Druze community. 12 children died on that soccer pitch, and 27 were injured.
Just remind people who the Druze are.
The Druze are a community within Israel.
Yeah.
They see themselves as having a separate identity to Israeli Arabs, but they're, in a sense, you could say they're part of the Arab community. They have their own history, they have their own culture. They're very much part and parcel of the Israeli community. And there are many Druze members in Magen David Adom. And we got a call. I didn't get the call, they got it in their headquarters, that a rocket had landed, and a senior member of Magen David Adom, who was in the area, went in his vehicle to Majid Sham, which is the name of the place, Majid Sham, and to provide paramedic help. And he found his 12-year-old daughter dead on the pitch. And then he went to tend to people he could save. That is what Israelis of every religion, not Jewish Israelis, have been living with. The October 7 atrocity resulted in a large number of non-Jewish people being slaughtered as well. That isn't really understood. And of course it resulted in a young 22-year-old girl from Ireland being slaughtered as well.
But can I just then ask you a personal question, if I may, Alan? which is it's unfathomable to me as a non-Jew looking at the history and looking at the Holocaust. I'm just in the middle of Jonathan Dimbley's book on Operation Barbarossa and the events around Kiev, in 1941. I mean, it's just barbaric, extraordinary stuff, and that was just the start of it. And I've been to Auschwitz. I've done all that. Sure. I've been all around Europe and various historical trips, but I just cannot fathom what it must be like. And I'm asking you, what is it like to grow up in a society, because you're getting it hot and heavy on social media, anti-Semitism pouring out through it. It's not made up. It's there. It exists in society. What's it like to be Jewish? And with all of the history that's there, that's why I mentioned at the start, which goes back to 3,500 BCE, all the ways forward to all of the recent conflicts. I mean, how do you see yourself and then take part in national politics in Ireland over 30 years, as you've done with very honourably, and then you find it ending with the way it ended temporarily and thank you for answering the first question about the next election. What's it like being Jewish? Well, look, because people don't. Yeah. We don't experience this in our lives.
Well, I'm Irish. I was born in Ireland. I love this country, but I'm Jewish as well, and that's part of my background and my culture. And of course, I have an affinity with Jewish people in the same way that Irish Americans have an affinity with the Irish in Ireland, but they've been living in America perhaps for decades through different families.
Yeah, but you have deep knowledge of Israel and what's going on there.
Of course, I have a huge interest in what happens there. I have a huge concern for the future of the Jewish people. I'm, like many people within Ireland's small Jewish community, appalled by what we've seen on Irish streets since the start of this conflict. I mean, you had 1,200 people slaughtered on the 7th of October, and on the 9th of October, you had a group of Irish people attacking the Israeli embassy in Ireland before Israel had done anything or could do anything to protect its people for the future. The selective narrative that people have adopted, that Irish trade unions have adopted, that teachers have adopted, that university students have adopted, and that practically every member of Leinster House has adopted, which ignores inconvenient truths that are part and parcel of this dreadful, awful conflict and the complexities that are ignored. There's a terrible dishonesty about that. I find it, my only conclusion is I don't think that, for example, the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach lack knowledge of the complexity. Maybe the Taoiseach does, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because I suspect most of what he knew about the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he learned from TikTok before he became Taoiseach, and I don't know how that's impacted on his perception. It certainly impacts on how he addresses issues. He never seems to miss an opportunity to demonize the Israelis. And of course, there are occasions when Israel deserves criticism. But he rarely says anything about Iran, just as the Taoiseach, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, rarely says anything about Iran. Look, there's been over 10,000 Hezbollah rockets fired at Israel. Until the last 2 or 3 weeks, nothing was said by government ministers about the Hezbollah rockets. But come back to your question for a moment. What's happening on Ireland's streets is deeply disturbing. It's gone from an anti-Israeli presentation and protest, which sought to ignore the atrocities of Hamas, ignored the objectives of Hamas to destroy Israel, certainly ignores anything to do with Iran, into the simple adoption of good old-fashioned anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, we had a march the other day in Ireland. Teachers for Palestine, God help us, they're teaching our children in our schools. They were carrying Hezbollah flags and Hamas flags. I mean, these are certified, prescribed terrorist organizations across the European Union. Hezbollah was responsible many, many years ago for blowing up a synagogue in Buenos Aires in Argentina. I mean, that had nothing to do with the Middle East. The objective of Hezbollah is to eliminate as many Jewish people, not just Israelis, as possible. But what we see in our streets and what is the perception of Jewish people here is, frankly, just growing anti-Semitism. But I know, and this is what keeps
how do you cope with
but
it?
what keeps me optimistic?
Yeah,
Keeps me optimistic is, although it seems to be a large number, and it certainly has the government parties freaked and trying to get on side with the protesters, I know the vast majority of Irish people realise what's happening is more complex than presented, frankly, frequently on RT and by our politicians. They understand this complexity. They understand this fanatical terrorists out to murder people. And there's a lot of good, decent people who don't share what appears to be the politically correct view within Leinster House at the moment. How do I know this? Because I go out shopping and do my thing in public, and the number of people who come up to me to give out about what's happening in our streets, and these are non-Jewish people. These are people who both live where I live in my constituency, who live in other parts of Ireland, and they basically see me and recognise me. And the amount of supportive comment is extraordinary. The amount of hate and anti-Semitism coming on social media directly from Irish sources.
From anonymous sources.
Anonymous heroes.
Yeah.
But it's clearly, in Ireland, is appalling. But what they've adopted, and what is quite extraordinary, and when this period is looked back on, people are going to hang their heads in shame. They've adopted the Hamas narrative. The Hamas narrative is the narrative in Ireland.
But do you find it deeply ironic then, just to jump into it, because I think it's a very interesting link, do you find it deeply ironic then that the Irish government are trying to ram through this hate speech bill? I know it's a longer term, but to try and curtail free speech. Because for me, curtailing free speech on a level of principle is wrong. I mean, we should have more free speech, not less. But it should be accountable to the person that's making the speech. We should know who's making the comment, and then society kind of sorts itself out. But that's not what's happening. I mean, it seems to me that what you're saying is that the Irish government are responsible for birthing more heat into this, and now we have Hamas and Hezbollah flags being waved openly in Irish streets, and at the same time, they're trying to push through legislation to try and to say, well, there's hate over here, but when we do it, it's not hate.
Look, the sort of
am I being too simplistic?
No, you're not, and and this is a really important issue. The theatrical incendiary commentary that comes regularly from the Taoiseach when he addresses the Middle East helps to copper fasten the perceptions, basically, that Jews globally are just out to murder Muslims for no reason. The narrative that comes from the government ignores something we discussed earlier. It ignores, one, that the conflict would be over if Hamas released the hostages and did what the IRA did, said the armed conflict is over. It ignores that 500 kilometres of tunnels were built in Gaza. I'd never heard a government minister or a single TD reference this stuff. It ignores that rockets are fired from within civilian areas. It ignores that when there have been very tragic civilian deaths in Gaza, they've frequently resulted from the Israelis targeting a weapons dump that's adjacent to a school or within a mosque.
Or underneath a hospital.
They've ignored the fact that it's known now that hostages were held in hospitals. And they have this very simplistic narrative which presents as if, just for the hell of it, the Israelis are bombing Gaza. And this is adding a huge level of, how would I put it? It's fermenting the hate. But it's contributing to the hate. Now, let's come to the hate legislation. I believe, and let me finish on that bit, I think what is happening here in the lead into the local and European elections, both the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach ratcheted up their targeting of Israel. And I think they thought that would get them political support from the marchers. And now as we're heading into the general election, the same thing is being replicated. What they're doing is ignoring all of the lessons of our own peace process in their entirety. They're sort of saying the Israelis can defend themselves, but God forbid they use any ammunition. They really shouldn't use ammunition. And on the hate bill, they seem to be oblivious to the impact that their inflammatory rhetoric creates. I would have to say, on occasions, the Taoiseach shows a bit more insight than the Taoiseach. It's the Taoiseach who seem to specialise in inflammatory rhetoric directly from TikTok very shortly after he became Fine Gael leader at Taoiseach. The hate bill was a complete shambles and a total mess. I would have written about it a year and a half ago. Yes, we do need legislation in that area. Yes, other European countries have legislation in that area. There's a requirement under European law that we address some issues that are not properly addressed within our legal system. And there is a need to deal with hate speech, but you need to provide a more comprehensive, better prepared piece of legislation. Ironically, the hate bill didn't refer to anti-Semitism.
That's the point I wanted to get to.
There was no reference in it to anti-Semitism. There's no attempt to define anti-Semitism. And in what wasn't understood, I think, by those who objected to the part of the bill that's been now removed, was it was so built around by exceptions that actually people who saw that as a threat to free speech were actually quite wrong, because there were so many exceptions. It was never going to work to curtail the type of speech that really should be curtailed. For example, Holocaust denial, which across a number of states in Europe is of itself a criminal offence. And basically, the Holocaust was a fact. 6 million Jews were murdered. This is something that for many years anti-Semites tried to deny and pretend that the Holocaust was some Californian movie production. So Holocaust denial as a moral principle, so people know of the Holocaust to give some moral compass as to what should never happen in the future. Holocaust denial is a criminal offence in a variety of European Union states. They didn't even adequately address that issue in the bill. But where the bill is now, a part of it that people objected to and that I believed shouldn't be removed but should be significantly changed is now taken out of it yesterday evening in the Senate, and the sort of a semi-detached version of it heading back into the Dáil, I understand. But either way, it's not going to adequately address the issues.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. But leaving aside anything to do with anti-Semitism, let's deal with racial hatred. RTE did a really good programme on the events that happened relating to asylum seekers in respect of a paint factory. And there you had basically thugs engaging in racist and threatening speech to people who were quite clearly not white. I don't care what colour anyone is. We're all human beings, whatever colour we are, whatever background we have, we're all human beings who should be treated with respect. Now, thugs racially abusing for no reason people acting as security guards in a location that's designated for asylum seekers. Whatever your view is about how the government is handling that issue, the type of speech they were engaged in, the threats they were uttering, and some of them doing it with their faces covered so they couldn't be identified, that we need to address. That should not be part of Irish society. And I know the vast majority of Irish people deplore that. And sadly, the government have utterly failed to properly address that issue. That RTE programme starkly illustrated that.
But do you not think that not excusing it at all, far from it. There's an interconnection there, because I think you're absolutely right about the vast majority of Irish people clearly seeing, can differentiate. But there's a deep level of frustration and annoyance in the general population over the recent influx coming in, and the way it was handled, and the word lack of consultation and all of that. And I think the government behaviour has actually made things worse, not better. the way it has handled it. It's been handled very poor. It's been very poorly handled.
It's been dealt with, again, with extraordinary incompetence. I'm looking at these things, and I'm outside the political arena at the moment. And as Minister for Justice, one of the issues I had to deal with was emigration and citizenship. And one of the things that we need to remember as Irish people was how many people had to leave our island years gone by, either for economic reasons, because of the economic state of the country, or we go back to the time of the famine, where thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Irish people had to leave and get somewhere else. And we do, as Irish people, have some obligation to recognise that we have a duty to be of help to others who are in genuine, enormous personal difficulty. But there's a way of doing that. There's a way of organising it without it being chaotic. There's a way of ensuring that important decisions are made that need to be made when someone claims.
But Alan, do you not see that the concern at the tip of the spear there is actually to be able to differentiate between those that are genuine people of concern that require help and those that are passporting in here as economic?
No, what you need is a coherent and workable system that people can lawfully use as economic migrants to come and work here. And we're hugely dependent in Ireland for migrants in our hospitals, in our nursing homes, in whole different ranges of businesses. I'm talking about migrants both from within the EU and outside the EU.
And they've integrated very well.
Hugely dependent on that. But you have in place a system where economic migrants who come here can come here through a system that operates correctly and efficiently. But where people claim political asylum and claim to be political migrants, you also have an efficient decision-making system. They don't have an efficient decision-making system, and they've been overwhelmed by the numbers. And I do understand and appreciate the numbers hugely increased since I became Minister for Justice, but there seems to be a complete absence of forward planning and insight and how you go about this in a way that actually works and is practical. And of course, and that is an issue, and I understand that being an issue, but we mustn't allow this country to become racist. We mustn't accept the type of racist narrative and dialogue that was so well illustrated in that very well done RT primetime programme.
Well, thanks for saying that. I mean, that's been a very good part of the conversation, just to get that out on the table and to differentiate between one type and another of the behaviour that's out there, and also the type of immigrant. You know, the government handling of it, I think, has greatly exacerbated it. My own sense is that there is a general disquiet about the whole thing amongst the general population, but the general population is not racist, and I don't think it will ever be racist.
I think a lot of people aren't upset by this. What they're upset by is seeing people encamping out on the streets and facilities not presented for them. What they're upset by, rightly upset by, and this isn't the fault of migrants, be they political asylum seekers or economic migrants. They're upset at the government's failure to adequately deal with the housing crisis. And when you have a crisis of that nature, people look for people to blame, and particularly political extremists try and use people as pawns to blame. And I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's accurate or right that anybody who's come here as a migrant be blamed for the fact that, frankly, we're not building enough houses, we're not building enough social houses. Yes, it's been hugely increased, but I go back to, Eddie, 2016, the very last Fine Gael parliamentary party I was present at a time of huge personal difficulty for me, heading into a general election, unsure of whether I'd be re-elected or not. And I made some comments at that meeting that I'm sure no one took the blindest bit of notice of. The Troika had left. We had got over the worst hump of our economic circumstance. And of course, the housing market had completely collapsed. And at that meeting, I told my former colleagues that there were two issues that the next government had to focus on and give the greatest priority to. The first was housing, and there was going to be a need for a huge housing building programme. I said this back in 2016 in a Fine Gael parliamentary party meeting, a private meeting. And I said the second is the gross inadequacy of beds in our hospitals. And that has to be addressed. And we need a far larger number of medical personnel and nurses in our hospitals within the different specialties. And I said, if Fine Gael gets back to government, whether I'm back in the Dáil or not, if those two issues aren't prioritised, it's going to create enormous difficulties for the country. The truth is, the next governments that came in, from an economic perspective, did reasonably well in the huge economic recovery that's taken place. But they took far, far too long to come to terms with the medical issues that need to still be addressed and with the housing problem, which has now become a crisis.
Can I just develop that with you? I had an interesting discussion with somebody who's coming in, going for independent TD in a rural constituency, and asked her, I said, what has been your biggest surprise in your research going around and having lots of meetings? And she said, autism in children. And it was a shocker to me. Now, I mentioned this to you off camera at the start. Yeah. It wasn't a shocker to you.
No, because they've got some of the big issues on the economy right. And I think this is what I don't like about politics. Like, the opposition will criticise them on everything and they'll never be told they got things right. And they've got things right. And we've got people back in employment in Ireland. And in a sense, the country is booming. But we have to get our priorities right and our moral compass right. And we can't blow the boom. I personally have some concerns about what happened in the recent budget, which was clearly designed for an election. But they've got some very important things wrong, and they haven't addressed them. So we have a huge, unacceptable waiting list for the assessment of children as to whether they have autism or any other issue of difficulty. There's an enormous backlog. And it's hugely wrong and totally unfair because it impacts not just on the children's development and families, impacts on their education.
And the family itself.
So this has a huge impact. We have over 250 children, some waiting 3, 4, 5 years for spinal operations. It's just not acceptable. I mean, we recently had a 22-year-old whose operation was so long delayed that she can never have a health issue fully and adequately addressed. I think the Ombudsman for Children today produced a report addressing that. We have a school in Clondalkin, a school for special needs children, which doesn't have adequate financing this year to meet its expenditure. For some technical reason, they were getting supports through the Central Remedial Clinic, and due to some change of financial issues within the government and the health service, or the Department of Health, the Central Remedial Clinic now can't provide them with the extra 120 or 130,000 this school in Clondalkin requires. Now, we have to get things right for children. I mean, I hear, the Taoiseach talking about children. He's talking about children out of Ireland. Now, let's focus on real needs that need to be addressed. We have a court case only a few months ago now, when a district judge complained that in 2 areas of Dublin, there was no social worker attached to over 230 children at risk. We don't have residential accommodation currently functioning for a number of children the courts have found to be at extreme risk and in need of residential accommodation. These issues may be perceived within government as minor. They may also be perceived as not really relevant to getting votes. But we have to get our moral compass right and ensure that we address these sort of issues.
But isn't part of the problem the failure to reform the way public sector services are delivered so that there are consequences at the senior management level when things don't happen? I mean, I'm going to segue in.
Well, I'm not going to absolve the political heads of government departments from accountability and responsibility, because I've been there. And I know the stuff you need to keep an eye on and you need to address and deal with.
But it wasn't just the politicians have made a mess of the Children's Hospital and the jails.
Well, the Children's Hospital saga is beyond bizarre. I mean, we've had the ridiculous waste of money on like the bicycle shed in Leinster House, and then you had the 1.3 million security hut in government buildings. But that pales into significance to what's happened with the Children's Hospital. I was in government when we were talking
What
about
was the estimate of
the
what it was going
Children's
to
Hospital.
cost during your period?
The estimate in about 2012 or 2013, I can't be sure which year it was, I think it was more likely 2013, was 650 million to build a children's hospital. And I think the ideal opening date was going to be something like 2018. And of course, a lot of it descended into confusion about where it'll be located and where it won't be located. But we've gone from 650 million to quite clearly 2.5 billion. And it's not just the increase in cost, which is extraordinary. It's the appalling planning failures around it. One of the reasons that we all know for this happening was that there were design defects. They kept on redesigning parts of the hospital after they'd contracted to have it built. I mean, there's supposed to have been, I don't know, is it 150 or 200 design changes made during the course of the build? Now, of course, that's going to add to the costs. What oversight was going on to ensure that timeframes were complied with? I mean, we're being told that most of the rooms that have been completed still aren't satisfactorily completed. There's still bits of things that need to be done. Now, remember, this is just the construction of the bricks and mortar. When the builders get off site, this hospital then has to be fully fitted out, and staff have to be recruited. Now, I think we'll be extraordinarily lucky based on the incompetence of oversight, management, planning, for which the government is responsible. If this hospital opens in 2026, I think it'll be little short of a miracle. It may well be that some small parts of it get open, because I think there's probably going to need to be a graduated opening as Crumlin Children's and the other hospital transfer across Temple Street, transfer across into the Children's Hospital. But I very much doubt if this hospital is going to be fully operational until we get into 2027. And it's outrageous. And the level of negligence involved in oversight and the incompetence in the planning of the hospital, ultimately I believe there's going to have to be a commission, a statutory, judicial-led commission of investigation into how this hospital has been planned and constructed.
And one final question, Alan. In your return to public office, you know, you're. I said it to you off camera at the start. You're in very good health for a 73-year-old man. You certainly don't look at. You're 10 years younger than that, as far as I'm concerned. What's your ambition in doing that? Well, I can understand you got a taste for it again. You're clearly very concerned, very committed, very passionate. All of that, highly intelligent, huge track record in writing and legislation and so on. What do you want to achieve?
Well, firstly, let's be clear about this. I don't take for granted I'm going to get elected.
No,
that's the first thing.
You're in a very tough constituency.
For the first time in my life, I'll be running as an independent.
Yeah.
I won't have the Fine Gael brand, as they say.
Yeah.
I may upset some people who live in my constituency, great Fine Gael people who loyally voted for me for many, many years in different elections. So I don't know what impact my running as an independent is going to have. One of my objectives is to make sure that Sinn Féin doesn't win the fourth seat in the constituency. Okay. I mean, I think the reality is that the three of the four seats are going to go to
just walk people
to members of the government parties.
Just give us a quick walk through the constituency for those that don't understand.
Well, the constituency is a very large constituency. It starts from, if you want to include Churchtown, Dundrum, Ballantyre, as you move across Clonskee, Mount Merrion, Kilmacud, Goatstown, goes up the mountains to Glencullen, Kiltiernan, back into Stepaside Village, all of Leopardstown, all of Fox Rock. It's a huge constituency, and it now includes part of Cabinteely as well. So it's a huge constituency.
And it number seats?
And there's going to be 4 seats. That last time it didn't include the Leopardstown, Fox Rock section of it, and it was a 3-seater. So I think, in so far as you can predict elections, and who can really accurately predict elections.
And who are the sitting?
The sitting TDs are one Fine Gael TD, Neil Richmond, and then the minister from the Green Party, who's also sitting TD who happily took my seat back in 2016. But basically, there's 2 sitting TDs running. And
So there's two up for grabs.
There's 2 up for grabs. And I think the likely outcome, based on the profile of the constituency, is that 3 seats will go to the current government parties. And there's 1 seat that I'll be contesting with Sinn Féin and the Labour Party and the Social Democrats and whoever else is running for. So to get elected, I'm going to need to get a significant number of first preference votes. So I take none of that for granted.
But for the 4th seat, will a lot of the will the other smaller parties, like, and I'm not including Sinn Féin here because they're a big party now, but are they putting forward newbies or are they putting forward knowns?
A mixture of both.
Okay.
A mixture of both. And there's, I'm sure, going to be other independents running. I'm not going to be the only independent. So I think maybe I have a 50% chance of getting elected. My motivation, coming back to where we started, firstly, many people want to see inheritance tax abolished. I believe it should be abolished. We haven't got into discussing the reasons why, but it's a double taxation of very discriminatory, unfair tax, interferes with families. It shouldn't. It's a tax that's been abolished in a lot of countries now in the world. In 9 different countries in Europe, it no longer exists. If someone wants to leave assets or money that they've lawfully acquired during their lifetime,
and upon which they paid massive
on which they've already paid tax, to their children or grandchildren, the state has no business getting involved. There's no reason why you should be double taxed. It's an old bit of socialist ideology going back to the 1960s that's still like part of our financial taxation provisions. It should long be gone. So one of the primary things I'm going to be doing is advocating that go. But of course, there are other issues I want to see addressed. Some of the issues I just mentioned that impact on children, I want to see seriously addressed. I want to see the waste of public money put to an end. If the government parties get back into government, we need someone to act as a watchdog on how they're spending the public's money. There should be no repetition of the excesses that we've seen with the bicycle shed and the security office. I mean, how can you take seriously a security hut that costs 1.3 billion? I also think there's another thing that's important as well. You're saying I'm 73. I'm in disbelief. I like to think I'm still 29. By the way, some of my friends think I'm probably certifiable for being interested in getting back into politics. I'm just concerned about issues. And I think issues should be addressed. I know there are issues that I have some reasonable degree of expertise in that are largely ignored in Leinster House. They haven't been addressed because they're not being dealt with in the Dáil chamber in a sensible way. They'll pop up for some party political point scoring, but not to get the thing really done. And one of the big issues is that seniors don't have a voice in Leinster House. There's an extraordinary number of people retiring from politics. They're not all of my age. Some of them are younger. Some of them are a great deal younger. But they're all experienced. There's a huge amount of experience and wisdom that's going to be lost to the Dáil after the next election because of the huge number of retirements. Over 1 million people on this island, by the time we get to 5 years on, will be over 65.
2030, yeah.
Over 1 million by the time we get to 2030 will be over 65. They don't have a voice. There's all sorts of issues that seniors, and I'm a senior, are concerned about. They have hopes and aspirations. They're perceived in politics to simply be people interested in being the recipient of handouts. And of course, pension payments are hugely important, and other social welfare assistance, such as fuel allowances, are hugely important. But seniors have other issues that they want dealt with and addressed. And funny enough, that brings us back to inheritance tax. A lot of seniors are concerned to ensure there's some reasonable financial security for the future for both their children and their grandchildren. And while the state is right and needs to build more social housing, the state actually tries to interfere and prevent through inheritance tax, those of us who are getting on in years in our wills, providing some future security for our children or our grandchildren. Seniors need to be seen as people with real important aspirations that go beyond simply being recipients of social welfare. They're not at the moment. And I would hope to give a voice to issues that those of us who are of retirement age and are concerned about. And of course, there's terrible ageism. Today's 70, I mean, I have no illusions of youth, but today's 70, for a lot of people, are people health-wise who had been in their 50s 20 or 30 years ago. We're forcing people...
I'd like to think so, yeah.
Yeah, but we're forcing people of great skill to retire.
Prematurely, yeah.
Who don't want to retire. We're losing their wisdom and expertise. We have a healthy economy with almost maximum employment, dependent, ironically, on immigrants from the EU coming in to fill jobs for us, as well as from outside the EU. But we're retiring elderly people. If you want to retire at 65 or 70, please do. But if you're active and you still have all your faculties and you have an area of expertise or a skill set, don't force people through ageism to retire. And you can even just look at the national broadcaster, RTE. They do it all the time.
Well, one last quick comment or question. Just to wrap, Alan, now that you are announcing that you're going to stand as an independent TD in one of the biggest constituencies in the country, have you, and the starter gun is about to go off, will this come as a shock to your team, or will they be expecting it? In other words, how much of a surprise is it going to be for the people around you? I'm not talking about Fine Gael.
No, well, the people around me, I've had discussions with.
Okay.
My son is supportive. He lives in Australia, but he thinks I'm bonkers for getting back into it.
Yeah.
My daughter thinks I'm treble bonkers.
Yeah.
My wife, Carol, knows I'm bonkers and has put up with me for many years. And of course, she's supportive, but a little wary of me getting back into it because of all of the difficulties that I went through when I was wrongly accused of not dealing with issues I'd properly and adequately dealt with. So she's a little wary of it, but she's supportive. And what's really happened is I've been testing the waters a little bit.
Right.
And I've been in contact with quite a few of those people who have been urging me to run and to say, look, we're considering it.
Yeah.
And you can't run as a one-man show.
Yeah, of course not.
You know, are you free or are you available to be of help and assistance? And to be honest, I've been gobsmacked as to the response I've received. And on next week, we have organised for a lot of those very good, supportive people to all meet up together because many of them don't know each other.
Okay.
And we're having a campaign meeting looking at how we will run an election campaign, and many of them are new to politics, but there's been extraordinary energy and enthusiasm. And at the very least, we'll all have an adventure together. Yeah. If I do or I don't get elected, at least if I get elected, I hope I'll be able to contribute something of value. If I don't get elected, well, I'll have done my best to make that contribution. And a lot of good people will have an adventure for the 3 or 4 weeks of an election campaign. And the main thing to hope is it doesn't rain on them too frequently.
Okay, well, and we leave it at that. I just want to thank Alan Shatter for extraordinary discussion. We covered an awful lot of ground.